And we are now live.
And we are live. Um, so, welcome to the first session of this series on trauma and spirituality. My name is Maria McNamara, and I have been involved with the Spirituality Center here since it, started to take root. I've worked a lot with Okoyeman on presentations on um, mainly historical and racialized trauma and and the ways out of that for people of color. But today we're going to be starting mainly with a more personal story. And I kind of used myself as, you know, as a way of kicking this off. Um, so I have a good deal of experience with trauma. I was diagnosed fairly late in life with essentially dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, which was a misnomer because it was never an issue of having more than one personality. It's an issue of having one that has become fragmented through early developmental trauma. So that is, that was my entryway into learning about trauma and the dynamics of it and the healing of it. Um, so I do have a PowerPoint that we can use as a starting place, and it'll kind of take us through, different manifestations of trauma, from the very personal to the very global. So, Blake, do you want to pull that up? Okay. So here we are, where Rivers Meet Spirituality Center, and we are looking at trauma and spirituality, which I tend to look at as a creative pathway to resilience. So, next slide. And there are some important things to know about trauma that are kind of key takeaways. Trauma separates us from ourselves and from others. And then spiritual practice grounds us in ourself, in our mind, and in our body. And it gives us the capacity to reconnect with others. So trauma is not something that can be healed in isolation. We need each other. We are essentially pack animals. So next slide, please. So when you're looking at trauma, these are some of the most common manifestations. Some of them happen right at the point of trauma. Others develop over time. Some become chronic and embedded and seem like personality characteristics. And so I'm sure if if you've had any personal experience with trauma at any level, you recognize some of these. I mean, some of the clearest, most obvious ones are depression and dissociation and substance abuse, eating disorders, all of these things that come out of trauma that is unprocessed. So the next slide. Okay, so in the brain, there are certain things that happen. And if you look at the big oval at the right side, that is our prefrontal cortex. It's our thinking center. It's where our rational, what we think of as us, as me, all of the rational processing we do, that becomes dismantled in trauma. Okay, it goes essentially offline. Also, our self-regulation center, which you can see, it's like that kind of enveloping gray area. We lose our ability to make decisions, to self-regulate our emotions. And also, there is the insula. It's called also the interoception center. Interoception is our ability to feel our presence in our own body, or where we are in a situation, or where the car is coming from that hit us, or where the man is, who possibly is coming to attack us. So we lose that spatial perception. And if you look lower down, the larger oval, it's called the hippocampus, and it's our center of memory. It's our ability to make a narrative story. So in trauma, we lose that capacity to put events in sequence, to make sense of a situation, because this, excuse me, has gone offline. But what becomes overactive is the amygdala, and that's the center of fear. So that is like the driving force in a traumatic instance. And this is what's going on in the brain. And one other interesting thing that happens in the brain, another area that goes offline, is if you've ever heard the terms like speechless terror or I was dumbstruck, it's because our speech area, which is called Broca's area, also goes offline. So that's kind of where we're at with the brain. So go to the next one. Okay, so right now we're living in an era of globalized trauma. And due to the pandemic, we've been attempting, in whatever ways we can, to cope in isolation. But, as I said earlier, we are pack animals. And so we are at a great disadvantage in dealing with the kind of like meta trauma that we're dealing with right now. So go to the next one. Okay, normally in community-based trauma, and if you think back to like Hurricane Katrina, or to what's still going on in Flint, Michigan, the suffering is shared among community members. The outrage is shared among community members. And there is a sense of community strength, that we are all in this together. And that becomes, a great source of resilience and coping capacity for communities. But that's something that seems to have been, taken from us recently. So the next slide. Okay, another obvious form of trauma is the trauma of wartime. It is something that is sanctioned by the state. It can become a badge of honor. It can become, you know, something that is worn with pride. And it is a shared experience, but it's only a shared experience if you were there. And so how does the civilian work? The civilian world makes sense now. And that reentry into a civilian life is something that service people have had to deal with. So the next one. And then we get more into more personalized traumas, and there are things that are familiar to most people, a sudden car crash, a cancer diagnosis. But even among these more personalized traumas, there are variations in public acknowledgement and the level of support. So some of the most common traumas are hidden and not talked about. Things such as child abuse, rape, domestic abuse don't get the same level of I don't know, communal support and acknowledgement as more physical illnesses or injuries. So the next one. Okay, and this is kind of my personal journey through processing and spiritualizing trauma. And one of the first things that I discovered is that trauma is extremely disorienting and confusing. And even beginning to touch on it involves, an unwanted degree of exposure and shame. So the next one. And these are just drawings that I did through this whole process of coming to terms. But, essentially, trauma wants to hide, and even from those who only want to help. So even from therapists, from pastors, from friends, anybody who is really wanting only to be there. And it takes a long time to shift that. So next one. So more of the same over and over. I mean, in the early stages, it becomes a matter of invisibility, just being the safety of the familiar, even though it's no longer working. And so, how do we bring what's hidden into a space where it's safe to talk about it? So next one. Okay. We struggle with our connection to humanity and with our very identity as human. I mean, one of the essential things about trauma is that it is dehumanizing. So part of the way of coming out of it is to reconnect with humanity, both within ourselves and with others. And I want to kind of just like move through these quickly because I think the most important part is having people talk about their own experience. But the next slide. Okay. So eventually, for me anyway, we can begin to develop some internal coherence and draw on internal resources. And for me, that was, a major part of the journey of developing some kind of an internal coherence and being ready to step out and reconnect with humanity. So the next one, it became a matter of going back in the presence of someone else. I mean, that was what therapy did and still does. But it became imperative for me to find a way to keep processing, to keep finding potential and finding ways that led to resilience. And for me, the drawing was a critical piece you know, when I was left to my own devices. So next, and it didn't always go well. All right. There were times and there will be times, when sometimes just stepping back and breathing is the best spiritual practice that you can do. And just to acknowledge where we are at can be the best next step. So next one. And I think part of, reclaiming self is the naming and claiming of identity. And that in and of itself is a spiritual practice, asking ourselves those questions. Who am I? And what can I accomplish in this world? So the next. So it becomes a matter of looking for those natural points of resilience, those points that are able to draw us out of our darkest places. And, you know, there's a lot of research into this. I mean, you know, the natural world. I mean, for me, it was a simple a blueberry grove, that was there and I could sit in and just be in. But if we have a chance to listen to what Bessel van der Kolk has to say in his video, I mean, the practices of drumming and singing and dancing in community, those are time honored and they've been time honored before the emergence of Western science. And now Western science is able to validate, these very ancient practices as ways that we just naturally self-regulate and bring ourselves back into resonance, back into grounding back into community. And also, when we are on our own, I mean, the practices of prayer and meditation connect us more deeply with ourselves and allow us to maybe touch on things and process things that you know that are hard in the cacophony and the busyness of the world. So taking time to spend in these practices of prayer and meditation, those are you know those are life saving. So the next slide. Okay, and then we go back, right? We fall back. We build ourselves up and then we fall back into the pit. And who on earth do you think you are? And you don't belong. And then again, it just becomes a matter of pulling ourselves back out of this and reaching for new resources. So the next one, there was something I found particularly interesting about ancient traditions of both seeing and being seen. And if you can see here, the eye of Oros, and the if you know the Jewish, the hand of Hamsa, and other kind of icons that made it known that being seen and seeing were part of being in humanity. So then for me, it became a process of, how do I present to the community? And how do we or I begin to be real? With that new incorporation of having lived through trauma and having incorporated it as a part of myself. How do I use it? Or how do we use it? In ways that bring about, well, I guess the beloved community. I mean, but a true sense of being part of something. So the next one, and it's just like, this is just another piece of that. How do we use our own brokenness and our trauma to heal ourselves and our communities? I mean, for many, we find a survivor mission, a spiritual journey in connection with others. And that in and of itself becomes part of the healing process. So go to the next one. And for me, one of the places I found was our local farmers market, a little West Side independent farmers market. And, during last year's pandemic summer, I spent every Saturday morning there, just connecting with the community. And I mean, what it boiled down to was essentially just resetting my own nervous system, as much as like collecting supplies for South Minneapolis, or food for food kitchens in our neighborhood. So that for me became a big spiritual practice. So then next slide. Okay. So one thing that has really become um, prominent lately in talking about trauma and healing is, well, you can see here Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, but it centers on the vagus nerve, which is also called the wanderer. And it's the 10th cranial nerve, and it is the longest and largest nerve in our body. And you can see from the diagram here that it connects virtually everything in our body. I mean, from our brain to our eyes to our ears to the heart, lungs, guts. Um, and what it does, you know, it's a nerve that gives us feedback as to what is going on in our body. And so when we say, I felt it in my gut, it is because our brain is getting information literally from our gut via the vagus nerve. I mean, and there are, you know, many scientists who say that there is more information going from the gut to the brain than vice versa. So being able to work with the vagus nerve gives us a way of regulating our emotional stasis. And that is something that ancient people have known. And it's one of the things that has now been documented by science. And I want to be able to show the video of Dr. Peter Levine, who will take us through an exercise that stimulates the vagus nerve, and it puts things back in order, in stasis. So what's the next slide? Okay, this is what happens. This is what we want to do, engaging the ventral vagal system. And you can see here there are different different phases of reaction and social engagement. So I mean, in high degrees of trauma, you can see up at the top, we freeze, we shut down, we dissociate. In this middle area, we are more inclined to use, the kind of desperate resources we have, the flight and fight reactions, rage, anger, irritation, frustration. But where we want to be in order to really tame trauma and to move ourselves back into the present to groundedness is we want to activate this social engagement area. And that's what we're going to be doing a short exercise with Dr. Peter Levine. And I think this is the last slide, but could you check?
Yes, that's the last slide.
Okay, so can you take it down? So I want to just check in with people and see where folks are at, or what you can relate to, and what you might want to share from your own experience to this point. And you just can unmute yourselves. And what have you experienced, and what have you found as resource.
Yeah, I found it interesting looking at the last slide. I mean, all of it is interesting, and but I've been throughout the pandemic increasing my just practice at home of meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that last slide was really interesting to just like have a visual to describe what I'm experiencing, because I'm definitely can relate. I'm more clear about where I am at what, based on what's happening in relation to that slide. And I'm just really grateful for the practice of meditation and the ability that what it's done for me. And I'm also just, I can't, it's a, if, like this has been around for thousands of years, this wisdom. And I'm just, and for me, I'm kind of new, kind of discovering it, but just so grateful that people have figured this out without science a long time ago. And it includes all the things that are important to me, like spirituality and the environment. And so I'm just, yeah, this is helpful too, to see I'm a biology person, so to see the actual science behind it is good too.
Right. I can see people talking, but they're muted.
I'll let Sam go first. Sam?
Okay, thanks. I'm fairly new to this. And thank you, Maria, for inviting me. This has been so informative. What I do as far as relaxation and when stress gets really hard for me, when it just starts building up, for me, it's really important that I go outside. I mean, I can do it inside too, but there's something about having the wind just blow through my head. And I visualize all of the stuff that's going on in my head. And as the wind blows, it blows all of the bullshit. Sorry. It blows all of the stuff out of my head. And that's something that I guess it's a form of meditation. Mm-hmm. But I've done that most all of my life. And after it sort of blows out of my head and I just let the wind carry it out of me, I have such peace that I can handle anything. Yeah. So I guess that's one of the things that I do. Nature is end all and be all for me. Yeah. Thank you.
Maria, I gained quite a bit from this, just seeing the full picture of things. I resonated with this in terms of a family member, a sister, whose experiences somewhat parallel what I saw in the images, and the impact that this had on her life. And just how it has been a lifelong struggle. So happily married, raised a family and all of that, but still some of that early in life experiences has impacted her all of her life. So then I also think of racial trauma, of the everyday nature of that. In no way parallels the kind of trauma that this represents and that I have seen in the life of my sister. But that's where that brings me to. So thank you.
I found it really nice, the two sort of things you had going at once, the biological charts and overview, but then also the personal journal, drawing journals. And it was hard for me not to connect them a little bit, like you're more dysregulated or more I don't know, stressed out images. It was hard not to see them as having those biological things that you had talked about, like the language centers going down, and some of those images would say things like "look at me, don't look at me," that, and would have contradictions like that. And then the interoception part, the feeling of your body in space, a lot of those images, they kind of had a superimposed contrasting thing. There'd be something kind of in light pen and then a really dark marker also with it. And then in the more regulated images, or the more calming images, there seemed to be more presence of nature, more kind of a unified quality to the drawings, like they weren't
Right.
something on top of something else.
Right.
And then also kind of the spiritual side, or kind of fairy images. Do those things?
Yeah, but that's what it felt like. It was like, you know, the process of drawing over years kind of mirrored that kind of, you know, up and down. I mean, I felt like so much I was learning and reading about trauma had to do with these like parabolas, you know, these cycles of regulation and dysregulation. And so the drawing was able to help me ride out those different, you know, sinking down and coming up, and sinking down and coming up. And then finally, like, being able to get beyond just a baseline, but having that feeling that there was something pulling me upward that I could grasp onto. And you know, that was when it felt spiritual. But what do others have in their back pockets that they use, you know, use as a way of pulling yourself out?
I thought it was interesting. So I have a mental health background, just for full self-disclosure, but I'll often use, it's interesting that you said kind of riding that feeling, because we'll often talk about riding the wave and just sort of letting the feeling come and letting the feeling go. Mm-hmm. And I use that a lot for myself too, when I find that something is triggering something in me, is to just hold it and acknowledge it, and then just think of it as a wave. So it's going to come and I'm going to feel it, mm-hmm. and then I'm going to let it go, which is a lot, I think, sometimes like meditation too, where the feeling comes and you acknowledge it, mm-hmm. and you let it go. And I thought a lot about some trainings that I've done, and it's interesting to me kind of what Amy was saying, like how some of these things like meditation we've done forever, but now there's this brain imaging and there's this science and there's all of this information that just confirms what we already knew, basically. And the one thing that I kind of kept coming back to is a training that I went to on kids, and they talked about how when kids are dysregulated, what do? We like shush them, we sing them a lullaby. Yep. And of course, what science has found is that when we do those things, we tend to do it at the same rate as what a mother's resting heart rate is. So, you know, that's what we're used to hearing. So it's not a coincidence that we sing lullabies at that rate, or that we rock our babies at that rate, or that we do anything. None of it's really coincidence. And the other thing I really liked was the brain stuff, and how sometimes our immediate, we don't have that prefrontal cortex that like, we're going to think about this and then we're going to react. That's not how it works.
Right.
My daughter had a heart surgery at 4 months. So this is what I was thinking about as I was listening to this. And the nurses would always tell me, don't worry, she's not going to remember this. Don't worry. Like, she's too little. She's never going to remember it. And I was basically like, oh, BS, like, yes, she is. And what's interesting is now she's 3, her heart surgery is at 4 months. And what we struggle with is feeding and eating. And it's not surprising because she was intubated twice. Yep. She had oxygen. She had all of this trauma around her face.
Right.
She doesn't know that. She doesn't remember what happened, but her brain is saying, danger, 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 danger. Right. Like, we need to remember this because this was bad for you. So now when all of these things are happening, it's not like she's like, oh, this reminds me of that time.
Right. It's not at a conscious level. It's at a cellular level that
right.
It's there.
And I wish sometimes even some of our therapists too, I'm like, don't push it. Like, do not push it. That's an invasion to her.
Mm-hmm.
Let her feel it. Let her process. Come back to it. Anyway, and just thank you for sharing all of those images and about your experience. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And there's one video that I was really planning on sharing, and it's just in one exercise of like regulating the vagus nerve. There's another one that Bessel van der Kolk talks a lot about what you were just talking about, Trista. How we treat children is very applicable to how we heal our collective trauma. So Blake, do you want, can you bring up the, this is Peter Levine.
This is about 5-minute video.
Yep.
I was recently online with a nurse who was working in a hospital where there was a lot of people coming into the emergency room and being put on ventilators. And she just couldn't get these thoughts out of her mind and these images of being there, of somebody being wheeled in, with their children crying and, and then pleading for help. And then they're not even being able to make real contact because they're wearing these hazmat suits. She was in such despair. And so we did a series of these awareness exercises. And at the end, she said, I really feel settled. So we did a session about a week and a half later. And, I asked her, how are things going? And she said, well, there's just as much illness and death that I'm exposed to on a daily basis, but it doesn't bring me down. It doesn't, I'm not in despair. I know what my job is. I do my job as best as I can. And then I go to the next person. And it's a lot, but it doesn't put me in despair. And she said also that a lot of times she would just go to the women's room and do some of these exercises if they felt that they were starting to get, to more stress, and then come back. So even just taking those few moments was enough to let her be helpful. And then also other people on the team noticed it. And so she guided them with some of these exercises after their shifts. So the whole group of people around the emergency room were doing these kind of exercises. This is an exercise which is really helpful when you have a sensation that seems strong. Very, very simple exercise, but very powerful. but also provisio, it can bring up different, it could bring up different emotions, and of course sensations. It definitely bring up different sensations. But the idea is to take an easy, full breath, and on the exhalation, to make the sound boo, as though it's coming from the gut, coming from the viscera, and then allowing the breath and the sound to go all the way out, and then allowing a new breath to come in, filling the belly and the chest, and then again continue the voo sound, directing the vibration from the belly. And anybody who, you know, is watching this online, you're invited. Again, just to know, it can bring up certain feelings and emotions, and of course sensations that, you know, that may have been there for a long time, but not acknowledged. So again, I take an easy, full breath, and on the exhalation, make the sound voo, coming from the belly.
Do this along with it.
And sustaining the sound and the voo, letting the breath and the sound go all the way out, then allowing the new breath to come in, filling belly, then chest, and again. So, vibrating it down here in the belly. And just rest and notice sensations, feelings, thoughts, images, and returning then to the sensation. So noticing the images or thoughts and then coming back to the body sensation. And just doing that as an exercise.
Okay. Okay. Did people have a chance to practice it? Okay. We have enough time to either just chat a little more or to watch the Bessel van der Kolk piece where he talks about kind of regulating a communal nervous system. Any preferences?
I'm open.
Okay. Well,
I don't know anybody else.
people want to see it.
Yeah, I like the idea of seeing.
Okay, let's do it.
So this one's about just under 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So we learned about the brain. The study we do on the brain is interesting because we look at something, we find something that's very interesting, namely that when you go back into your trauma, the back part of your brain, the part of your brain that has to do with your survival, as we have in common with all animals, that has no capacity to think, but it's just your survival brain that makes you eat and fight and take care of yourself in an animalistic way, is hyperactivated when people enter their trauma. And the front part of the brain that has to do with cognition, understanding, figuring things out, is actually sort of largely wiped out. And the more you get into your trauma, the less you can think and reason and understand. And so slowly we learn that there's really only two ways in which you can change that basic arousal survival part of your brain. One of them is bottom up, by the way you breathe and the way you move. So dancing, moving, rhythmical activities. The people who really understand that, of course, are kindergarten teachers. Kindergarten teachers know everything because they deal with little kids who have hardly any frontal lobe, and they have these little frontal lobes that go on, but you need to be modulated all day. So what do you do with little 4 and 5-year-olds? You do rhythmical things, and you blow bubbles, and you do activities that calms that limbic system down, and you organize it, and you set limits, and basically they get it right. And that's about what we need to do with all traumatized people also, is to just breathe and move and get those basic rhythms going as you do in 5-year-olds. But there's another part of our frontal lobe of our conscious brain that runs through the middle. It's called the mohawk of the brain, and it runs right here through the middle. Various brain structures, all the way from back to front, and those allow you to start getting control over that very primitive arousal system. And that mohawk of the brain is involved in noticing yourself, feeling yourself, something that we call interoception, experiencing your inner world. And so slowly, we and a large number of people who are into this field slowly start drifting out of mainstream thinking into a new way of thinking. So the mainstream of thinking is the Northern European way of thinking. As I look around this room, it's a fairly undiverse crowd. You may have noticed that also. So most of you come from a similar ethnic background as I do. And so people who come from our ethnic background basically come from a culture that is where if you feel bad, you take a swig. That's the white people's culture. If you feel bad, you go, and that culture comes across the Atlantic and is still our mainstream culture. You see it on television. I shot my television, so I don't know what television looks like, but it's probably the same stuff. And the television says, are you depressed? Ask your doctor for Zoloft. Are you depressed? Can't you sleep? Ask your doctor for Lunesta. And what the ads don't say, because it would be anti-American or anti-European or anti-white people's culture, is that when you're depressed, you can do things to make you feel better because you have inbuilt self-regulatory structures in your brain, which happens to be not part of white people's culture. So I'm really unhappy in Beijing, and I sit in my hotel room and I look down to the park below me, and I see 10,000 Chinese going, what the hell are those people doing? I have nothing to do, I'm homesick. I go, you feel so much better afterwards. I think, wow, these Chinese know something we don't know, that there's certain movements that seem to activate some damn thing in your body that seem to calm you down. And then I go to India, there's a whole bunch of people saying like, India is not a hard place. I wouldn't recommend anybody to live there because, so how do you survive in India? You gotta, and it also changes your brain. So and then I'm part of the Truth Commission in South Africa, and I travel around with Bishop Tutu, and that actually was the most interesting experience of my life because what happened in South Africa is that 4 million people who happen to share my genetics have been horribly oppressing 40 million black people. And now things are going to change. And after you have been oppressed for 40 years and you have seen your relatives murdered, what do you want to do? You want to kill the bastards. And Mandela and Tutu get together and say, you know, we'd like to kill the bastards also, but if we do, our country will be born in bloodshed. And if our country is born in bloodshed, we'll never make it. And so they set up the Truth Commission in South Africa. And the Truth Commission in South Africa was not to bring truth to black people, it's to save the white people from being killed, basically. And you know what it did? It saved the white people from being killed. And how did they do it? Is that Tutu was the best trauma therapist I've ever seen. He understood trauma therapy. And he had people tell their stories, but even more so, he'd be in a gathering like this. I traveled around with him. And before doing anything, we'd sing together. And when you sing together, which I hope you'll do for Christmas in the next few weeks, you feel so much better. And you start giggling. And you start feeling like, wow, what a cool people. We're all singing together. And they do a little dancing. And they dance together. And you feel like, hey, nice. And then people sit down and they start telling their trauma stories. And everybody falls apart. And Tutu goes like, let's sing. And they sing. They calm themselves down. And they dance. And they go back and tell another piece of the trauma story. And slowly, because he was able to magnificently regulate the arousal systems of very large number of people, people felt understood. And they felt safe. And they felt that people would take care of things. And there was completely no bloodshed during the transformation of South Africa. The last time I was in South Africa, I was invited by an organization, I didn't quite know who it was, and I have dinner in their house. This is 2008, I think, 2007 it was. And they say, let's bring out a toast to President Bush. I say, is it okay if I sit this one out? Like some of you, you may not have such positive feelings about the invasion of Iraq and our having killed 200,000 people because we got pissed off about the World Trade Center. And the next thing they say is, we got screwed by the Truth Commission. I go, oh boy, I'm in the wrong company. They owe their life to the Truth Commission. The only reason that they didn't get killed is because Bishop Tutu controlled the rage of the people in South Africa, the justified rage. I'll tell you another Truth Commission story. So I'm at a reception with Nelson Mandela and other people. And so, like we. And so I talk to him and I say, you know, I'm a trauma specialist and I'm part of your Truth Commission. And you know, I've read about you and I know that you were the head of the terrorist army before they sent you to Robben Island. I mean, I didn't have a reputation of really being Mr. Nice Guy. And I don't quite know how I said it, but somehow I didn't alienate him. And then you go to Robben Island and you come out this amazing, enlightened person. What do you think was it about Robben Island that transformed you from a very angry man into this enlightened person? And without hesitation he says, boxing. I say, boxing? He said, yeah, when you box, you need to know precisely where you are, you need precisely where the other person is, you need to anticipate what the other person is going to do, you need to anticipate what your body is going to do, you need to anticipate how your body can react to it, and you need to set up very complex circuits of anticipation and interaction with the person you're dealing with in order to survive. And I go, actually, those are exactly the circuits of the brain that are damaged by trauma, where you no longer can interact in a really attuned way with the people around you.
So we are close to end time. Any observations that people would like to share? So I can see you talking, Sam. Can't hear you.
I thought I unmuted it, sorry. It was just amazing. I enjoyed that so much.
Yeah.
I don't have very much more to say about that, but that was, thank you so much.
There are really brilliant, insightful people doing work on this, you know, currently. And I just want to talk about the next coming weeks. Next week will either be me presenting on Yoga Nidra, which was a practice that I was really engaged with. And or also another presenter who will be talking about like basic self-care through healing trauma. And then the third week we will be having Bobby Simpson Epps, who is she's very well grounded. She's an expert teacher on the ACEs, on the Adverse Childhood Experiences scale, and also about racialized and generational trauma. And then the fourth week, we will have Jim Rock, who is a Native American astronomer, philosopher, who will be talking about how his community has exhibited both, you know, his resilience over time. So stay tuned. Blake or Kogimon, any closing thoughts or words?
Yeah, Maria, I have appreciated this very much, and I really look forward to your next presentation. And certainly whoever comes next week, it will add to the discourse, but I really look forward to your continuing the sharing that you started to send tonight on trauma.
Okay.
And I thank you very much. I thought all the pieces really fit well together, and it was really a great learning this evening. So thank you very much. Look forward to your future presentations.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you also, Maria. I mean, I'm very grateful for the sharing that you've and the knowledge that you have and that you're willing to share it.
Thanks. All right.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening.